Introduction to Ressentiment, Its Phenomenology and Clinical Significance. Introduction by Roger Brooke. John White's paper is the only one to address the question of psychological types. He approaches Jung's notion of the feeling function, which at its heart is about our capacity to differentiate values, through a phenomenological explication of Nietzsche's discussion of ressentiment, as taken up and developed by an early pioneer in phenomenology, Max Scheler. Ressentiment is an organizing mood obscured by feelings such as rage or envy, but its hallmarks are impotence, the desire for revenge, loss of any meaningful object-relatedness, and an inversion of values. White develops his phenomenology of ressentiment in terms of deficit in the feeling function. Because ressentiment is so diffuse, organizing, and often paranoid in its structure, he indicates why it tends to be prominent in personality disorders. He then suggests how the Jungian psychotherapist might be of help, although therapeutic goals may remain more aspirational than met. What is especially interesting is the development of a dynamic understanding of this fateful phenomenon together with therapeutic recommendations based on working with the feeling function. Ressentiment, ITS Phenomenology and Clinical Significance by John White. Abstract. The phenomenon of ressentiment becomes a topic of philosophical discussion beginning in the late 19th century, with the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. However, interest in ressentiment has remained largely within the confines of philosophy. In this chapter, I suggest that ressentiment is not only a philosophical but is also of psychological interest, that it is in fact an important and widespread clinical phenomenon, the clear understanding of which is the key to its treatment. I begin by utilizing the phenomenological analysis of ressentiment by Max Scheler, which permits a sufficiently clear characterization of it to differentiate ressentiment from related phenomena. I then discuss Scheler's concept of value and its relevance for ressentiment, especially given Nietzsche's statement that ressentiment creates false moralities due to its experienced inversion of values. I link these ideas to Carl Jung's analysis of the feeling function, arguing that intense ressentiment in practice becomes a deformation of the feeling function, overlaying the latter's normal functioning with emotional and cognitive distortions. In conclusion, I offer clinical suggestions and specific clinical vignettes to illustrating ressentiment in clinical practice. Introduction. One of Friedrich Nietzsche's most interesting contributions to philosophy and, I would suggest, to psychology is his description of the nature of ressentiment. By ressentiment, Nietzsche refers to a specific psychological and emotional phenomenon, an intense, partially unconscious, and in some sense structural, resentment, one which can become so potent and so definitive an emotional force in the human psyche that it produces substantial deceptions both about oneself and about the world. According to Nietzsche, ressentiment is creative, in that it produces false moralities by means of an inversion or transvaluation of values, while simultaneously deforming one's emotional experiences to the point that value inversion is experienced in some respects as if it is authentic and valid. Nietzsche, 2009. In this chapter, I will suggest that ressentiment is an important and widespread clinical phenomenon, that what clinicians often describe simply as anger or rage is often better understood as ressentiment, and that this fact has potentially important clinical and technical consequences. I will begin by describing ressentiment, with the help of phenomenologist Max Scheler. Though Nietzsche's descriptions of ressentiment are emotionally potent, Scheler better articulates the nature of ressentiment phenomenologically, and his analyses are far more useful both philosophically and clinically. Second, I will relate Scheler's phenomenological description specifically to Carl Jung's understanding of the feeling function, since the latter, I will suggest, is particularly afflicted when a person suffers from ressentiment. Finally, I will illustrate some clinical issues associated with ressentiment through a few fictional but realistic clinical vignettes. The phenomenology of ressentiment. Our first step is to describe ressentiment according to some general and essential features, which I draw largely from Scheler. Scheler's phenomenological and schematic definition of ressentiment is as follows. Ressentiment is a self-poisoning of the mind which has quite definite causes and consequences. It is a lasting mental attitude, caused by the systematic repression of certain emotions and affects which, as such, are normal components of human nature. Their repression, however, leads to the constant tendency to indulge in certain kinds of value delusions and corresponding value judgments. The emotions and effects primarily concerned are revenge, hatred, malice, envy, the impulse to detract, and spite. Scheler, 1998, page 29. Thus ressentiment, on Scheler's account, is in some way similar to highly charged emotions like anger, rage, fury, and the like. For like those latter feelings, ressentiment is generally born of intense emotional energy which, once repressed, may take any number of other emotional forms, often including value delusions and distorted value feelings, both conscious and unconscious. How often a torrent of exaggerated value feelings and judgments flow from our lips when we are in the grip of ressentiment. However, ressentiment is further defined by certain other distinctive features. Thirst for revenge, according to Scheler, is the most important source of ressentiment, due to the specific nature of revenge. Revenge is characterized first of all as a reaction to being attacked or injured by someone. Nonetheless, reacting to an attack, though essential to revenge, is insufficient to define it. For example, self-defense can also be a reaction to an attack, but it is not revenge. Revenge is, in contrast, characterized by two further features. 1. First, in revenge, the immediate impulse to return the attack is internally checked. 2. Second, this checking of the immediate impulse is motivated by the feeling that one might not succeed, i.e., that following through with this aggressive impulse might result in defeat. Scheler, 1998. This checking of the emotionally charged and often aggressive reaction also gives a distinctive emotional cast to ressentiment. For, according to Scheler, the feelings of anger and rage thereby become associated with feelings of incapacity or of impotence, born of the sense that one may not succeed in retaliating, at least in the current moment. Consequently, what might at a conscious and intellectual level be experienced as that kind of prudence which is the better part of valor, at an affective and partially unconscious level includes an emotional tone of impotence and powerlessness, and, we might add, the potentially devastating blow to self-esteem which can accompany those latter feelings. The affective charge and the acute inrush of energy associated with retaliation is therefore intentionally blocked, the dammed-up energy, over time, becoming the self-poisoning, to which Scheler refers in his definitional statement. Scheler sees ressentiment as the natural endpoint of a relatively typical emotional process, a series running from desire for revenge, to rancor, then envy, the impulse to detract, spite, and until finally genuine ressentiment arises. Each of these emotional contents, on Scheler's account, move in the direction of ressentiment if one does not deal with them psychologically and/or morally, and, once the trajectory begins, these feelings often include sufficient emotional force to take over substantial parts of a personality, at least at times. Particularly important here is the part of this series of experiences mentioned above in this paragraph, beginning with the impulse to detract. Scheler notes that the thirst for revenge typically has a definite object, the person who attacked us, and thus the impulse to vengeance disappears once it is achieved. Revenge does not outlast its motives. In contrast, the impulse to detract, as is also true of spite and of ressentiment itself, is an attitude which has in some measure become disconnected from its original motivational objects. It has freed itself, as it were, from its experiential moorings and thus exists apart from the original motivating object. Since it does not have definite objects, it therefore cannot be satisfied or relieved by this or that expression of detraction. On the contrary, the impulse to detract seeks those objects, those aspects of men and things, from which it can draw gratification. It likes to disparage and to smash pedestals, to dwell on the negative aspects of excellent men and things, exulting in the fact that such faults are more perceptible through their contrast with the strongly positive qualities. Scheler, 1998, page 30. Generally speaking, when intense emotional reactions of this kind gain ground in our personality, we either cannot see the positive in someone or cannot do so without being provoked to envy, detraction, spite, or resentment, and therefore tend to underline what is negative about them, ignoring or distorting the positive sides. In the case of full-blown ressentiment, the negative impulses often appear unmotivated because the person on whom one vents one's spleen may be totally unrelated to the resentful person, just someone heard about in passing or a character in a movie or a distant celebrity. We all know people, I imagine, who spend their time detracting others, who can't hear about any person or situation which includes positive value qualities without denigrating that person or situation by cynically underlining whatever is negative about them or by devaluing those positive value qualities by extolling others in comparison. In many cases, on Scheler's account, this state of affairs is the result of ressentiment and its accompanying feelings of inner scarcity, in contrast to the perceived abundance in others. In some cases, these feelings can become so large and intense and become so disconnected from definite objects that they virtually cannot be satisfied by any given situation. They have, so to speak, become too large and too disconnected from their sources and objects for any specific expression of the ressentiment to achieve satisfaction or comprehensive release. Hence the feelings often become a vague rage against the collective, not so much because the person is concerned about, say, social justice or about someone undermining the American way of life, but because the ressentiment is so large and object-free, that only a virtually indeterminate collective of some sort feels like it can contain the experience. This generally vague and vaguely general quality is one of the decisive characteristics of ressentiment. Ressentiment, though originally born of definite experiences of resentment toward definite objects, can grow internally like a psychological infection, a spiritual pus, constantly expanding both in its own magnitude and in the range of real or imagined objects. Ressentiment is not a straightforward resentment about this or that event or toward this or that person. Such resentments have definite object relationships in both the psychoanalytic and the phenomenological senses and so can be dealt with through straightforward psychological and/or moral effort. They transform into ressentiment proper only after a process whereby those feelings lose their motivational moorings and become instead a vaguely general yet potent feeling with no definite object but rather encompassing any or even all possible objects of experience which remind the person of the ressentiment. Thus, if unchecked, ressentiment can become the general and essential form of a person's emotional life, the dominant feeling tone dominating all other feeling tones, since its undifferentiated nature includes no inner principle of limit. Value inversion. The most defining feature of ressentiment, however, extends beyond these delineated characteristics, which can in some measure be shared with other emotional reactions such as spite and malice, namely, that ressentiment includes an inversion or transvaluation of values. Now in English-language philosophies and thinkers, the term value tends to have a strongly subjective cast, due, on the one hand, to the influence of empiricism and positivism on most philosophical and social science disciplines and, on the other, the fact that consumer capitalism appears to be a stronger cultural dominant in many English-language cultures than it is, say, in continental European settings. Consequently, value often more or less correlates to subjective preferences in English-language thought, White, 2023a. But the German-speaking intellectual world in which both Scheler and Carl Jung wrote about value was deeply imbued, in both its philosophical and sociological assumptions, with a quite different view of value. For each assumed that there is such a thing as intrinsic values, i.e., values which, as it were, form a part of the furniture of world, and are not merely subjective evaluations and preferences, and which may even form a system of ideal value relationships. This more objective and intrinsic concept of value was already implicit in Nietzsche, a major influence on Jung, and was relatively common in the intellectual milieu in which Jung wrote in the 1920s. By way of example, both phenomenological and neo-Kantian philosophical traditions and the Southwest German school of social science affirmed such conceptions of value, despite their disparate theoretical articulations of the nature of value. Often, the prototypical examples of value were beauty and moral values of various kinds. When I am touched by the beauty of the starry sky or moved by a noble act of forgiveness or outraged by a callous injustice, it seems somewhat far-fetched to call such experiences mere, subjective preferences. Rather, such experiences seem to transcend my preferences. If anything, they break through my encrusted subjectivity, demanding I rise to the occasion of acknowledging them on their own terms. Value, on this model, is both too objective in its demands and too universal in its impact to be validly reduced to individual personal subjectivity. Scheler, 1973, von Hildebrand, 2020. As a way of describing this phenomenon theoretically, we might, following Scheler, posit a general hierarchy or rank order of value types, such that values come in kinds or categories, united according to certain thematic connections. Scheler, 1973. Scheler, for example, differentiates values of utility, pleasures values, vital values, cultural and political values, and spiritual and religious values, each a categorical type and each category differentiated each from the others. Further, according to Scheler, these categories taken together form a system of connections, such that any given category may be intrinsically higher or lower than another category. For example, Scheler considers pleasure values, i.e., values associated with physical pleasure and displeasure, to be a category of values all its own. A different category of value would be what Scheler terms vital values, those values associated with organic life, e.g., with health, physical well-being, psychological flourishing, and so forth. Though each of these categories forms a thematically unified set of values, they also stand in a hierarchical relationship in that, all things being equal, vital values are of a higher order than pleasure values, a point with both psychological and ethical implications. Scheler would argue, by way of example, that pleasure values are legitimate pursuits, ethically legitimate, insofar as they do not violate higher categories of value, such as vital values around health and well-being. Yet to pursue pleasure values, let's say the pleasure of smoking, to the extent that it actually harms the higher values of life and health, would be, for Scheler, questionable from an ethical standpoint. A cigar here and there is one thing, consistent smoking of such would be another. Such a hierarchical conception also has implications for collectives. By a similar logic, to pursue excessive and unnecessary consumption as a society, usually pursuits of both the utility and the pleasure types of value, to the extent of long-term damage to the environment, a set of higher, vital values, would be ethically questionable. White, 2012. Whether or not one accepts this theory in all its details, Scheler's idea of a ranking of value types can help us understand ressentiment. For if value types have an inherent ranking, it would follow that understanding that ranking could aid us in understanding a relatively healthy feeling function, for the latter is the function, as we will see, associated with the experience of value. Indeed, for Scheler, our moral substance as persons can in part be evaluated by the extent to which we experience, understand, and live according to values in a way that approximates this value hierarchy. But then it also follows that, if there can be distortions in the realm of feeling, feeling being the function by which we experience value, those distortions can in principle result in experiencing value according to a different order, i.e., as a value inversion, just what Scheler and Nietzsche posit about ressentiment. Jung and the feeling function. Jung's articulation of the feeling function assumes just this sort of analysis of value, and, once that is recognized, we can better understand what he asserts about both feelings and values and further what that tells us about the essence of ressentiment. When Nietzsche and Scheler refer to an inversion of values, they each suppose there is something like a rank order among values and that hierarchical order is significant both emotionally or psychologically and also ethically. They also assume that a person's experiences and perceptions of such values can be modified and distorted through certain kinds of emotional experiences, such as ressentiment. The clinical significance of this latter point hinges in part on the nature of the feeling function, the function through which one experiences values. What is the feeling function? Jung claims, based on his own empirical observations, that there are four basic functions to the psyche: thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation, a generally well-known thesis due to the popularity of the Myers-Briggs personality test, though the latter perhaps conceives the function somewhat differently from what Jung originally had in mind. For there is a discernible tendency to understand these functions as something like personality traits, rather than the more dynamic range of possible adaptive relationships to one's environment, which Jung understands them to be. Jung, 1923. In clinical experience, one often finds that one's clients have one dominant function, one or two secondary functions, and one or more functions which Jung would describe as an inferior function, a function significantly less developed than the others. Much of classical Jungian analysis is predicated on recognizing concrete deficits in healthy adaptation due to inferior functioning and consists in aiding one's patient in developing the inferior function. Jung, 1972, White, 2023. Generally speaking, the lesser used a function is, the more unconscious it is, because the psychic energy and structural orientation are therefore latent and not readily available to the ego and conscious psyche. The feeling function is contrasted to the other functions primarily according to 1. Its primary object and 2. The quality of its functional experiences. Regarding the first point, Jung defines the feeling function in part through its having reference to values. Jung, 1971a, para 723 ff. Jung in fact differentiates the thinking and the feeling functions by, on the one hand, noting that each are rational in their orientation, that is to say, they connect directly to the world, but that whereas thinking relates to the nature of things, feeling relates to the values of things, an idea suggesting or at least parallel to Scheler's conception of value being an actual part of the world, not a mere placeholder for subjective evaluations. The psychic qualities associated with the feeling function are of course feelings, a specific sort of psychic experiencing comprised of distinctively emotional characteristics, clearly differentiated from the kind of experiencing characteristic of thinking, sensing, or intuiting, and presumably further differentiated according to nature and kind, such as love, hate, gratitude, revenge, etc. Jung also distinguishes affect, which is typically an excess of emotional energy, excess, here implying that affect does not correlate to value and to the value-charged situation, from feeling proper, the latter correlating or being in some sense appropriate to the value to which it has reference. Jung, 1971a, White, 2023. Jung says little about the nature of value and value experience directly, other than to insist that values correlate to feelings and thus to the feeling mode of adaptation, though he does claim that value is experienced in terms of greater or lesser intensity of feeling, evidently a way of describing that values are higher or lower in rank while simultaneously using interior, quantitative, and energic terms, greater or lesser intensity. In favor of Jung's usage here is the tendency to speak of having strong feelings about something, a phrase suggesting that something is experienced as extremely important or, in other words, ranking very high in value or being a disvalue very much in opposition to a value ranked high. If this is a sufficient description of the feeling function according to Jung, it aids our understanding of ressentiment. For it would suggest that ressentiment is not so much a feeling in Jung's technical sense of an emotional experiencing correlating to a value as a case of extreme affect, and not just the usual affect associated with an activated complex but a kind of affect running amok in a person's emotional life. Rather than correlating to definite values, as a simple case of resentment would, it is rather a kind of affective infection which in essence overwhelms and derails the natural mode of the feeling function, even overlaying healthy value experience to the point that the feeling function itself becomes disengaged from values and value hierarchies and distorts its own experience. We would expect the person whose feeling function has been either partially or totally colonized by ressentiment simultaneously to experience just enough of genuine value in the other to produce, for example, envy, rancor, spite, and resentment, but also to deform and overwhelm that value experience through ressentiment, either comparing those good qualities negatively in comparison to someone else's purported values or highlighting purported negative and shadow qualities in the resented person, even if those supposed negative and shadow qualities are actually due to the positive values implicitly perceived but explicitly denied, a straightforward value inversion. Furthermore, we would expect such a person to live out sets of emotional contradictions due to the predominance of ressentiment, such as occasions of a generally sound feeling function alternating with other occasions where their conscious psychological and ethical compass is partially or entirely thrown off amidst inexplicable feelings of rage, leading for example to caustic words aimed at a loved one, volcanic and destructive effect around relatively insignificant issues, emotional abuse toward those significant others apparently without provocation, even to the point of possible violence to oneself or others. This latter can occur due to a combination of, on the one hand, the emotional intensity of ressentiment having no specific or definite outlet which can satisfy it as well as no inner principle of limitation and, on the other, there being little moral compass to inhibit it, because one's relationship to value and value hierarchies, the basis of one's moral compass and ethical life, is exactly what the experience derails. Consequently, once ressentiment is activated, it can be a wide-open question what behaviors will follow.